The Black Hawk hit the roof of Stone Valley Medical Center so hard the windows on the 8th floor shook. It was 11:47 p.m. Lightning split the sky over Harlow County in two ragged halves. The rotor wash scattered papers off a nurse's station cart and sent an IV pole crashing sideways into the hallway wall. Inside Trauma Bay 1, every head turned toward the ceiling. Then the doors blew open and they brought him in, massive, gray-faced, soaked in blood and rain, with two soldiers flanking the gurney and a third pressing both hands into a wound that had no business being survivable. The commander's eyes found the room, found the faces. His hand shot out and grabbed the nearest nurse by the wrist. "Emily Dawson," he rasped. His voice was gravel, dragged across concrete. "Get me Emily Dawson, now!" The trauma bay went so quiet you could hear the heart monitor from the hallway, because Emily Dawson was standing 6 feet away, and everyone in this hospital acted like she didn't exist. If this story finds something in you, like it, drop your city in the comments, and follow along to the very end. I want to see how far this reaches. Emily had been at Stone Valley Medical Center for 14 months, and in those 14 months she had learned one thing with the kind of clarity that only comes from being reminded of it every single day. She was tolerated here. Not respected. Not seen. Tolerated. The way you tolerate a piece of furniture that's in a slightly inconvenient location, but not inconvenient enough to actually move. She was 29 years old. She had a nursing degree from a state university, 2 certifications in emergency and critical care, and a 4-year gap in her employment history that she described on her resume as personal health circumstances and never elaborated on further. The hiring committee at Stone Valley had looked at that gap and quietly flagged it. HR had noted it. Patricia Sloan, the nursing director, had circled it in red ink during Emily's probationary review and asked, in the politely cutting way she had perfected over decades, whether Emily had resolved whatever it was that kept her out of the workforce. Emily had said yes. She had not explained. Patricia had made a note. The 4-year gap was not a health issue. It was not a personal crisis. Emily Dawson had spent those 4 years in the United States Army, deploying twice to locations she was not permitted to name in casual conversation, doing work that did not appear on any public record, under a service designation that remained classified above the pay grade of most people who would ever sit across a desk from her. She had come back. She had rebuilt. She had chosen nursing because she understood, in her bones, in the tissue memory of her hands, what it meant to be the person standing between a living human being and the thing trying to kill them. She had chosen civilian life because she was 25 years old, and she had already seen enough of the other kind. Stone Valley Medical Center was not what she'd hoped for. The ER ran 3 attending physicians on night shift. Senior attending was Dr. Nathan Briggs, mid-40s, Stanford-trained, the kind of man who believed that confidence and competence were the same thing and had enough of the first that no one had ever seriously questioned whether he had enough of the second. He wore his hospital ID clipped to his breast pocket at exactly the right angle. He spoke to nurses the way some people speak to customer service representatives, not unkind exactly, but with the particular detachment of someone who has already categorized you. He had categorized Emily on her 2nd week. She'd flagged a medication dosage she thought was off. She had been right. He had corrected the dosage without acknowledging that she'd raised it, and when she'd followed up to confirm the change had been documented, he'd told her pleasantly to focus on her assigned tasks. She had focused on her assigned tasks. She had also continued to notice things. That was the problem with Emily Dawson. If you asked the people in this hospital who had opinions about her, which several of them did, she noticed things she wasn't supposed to notice, and she didn't always pretend that she hadn't noticed them. Not in an aggressive way, not in a way that could get you written up for insubordination, just in a quiet, persistent, factual way that made certain people profoundly uncomfortable. Patricia Sloan was one of those people. Patricia had been nursing director at Stone Valley for 11 years. She ran a tight department, her words used often. And a tight department meant everyone in their lane, performing their defined function, not creating friction with the physicians who ultimately drove the hospital's reputation and therefore its funding. Nurses who created friction did not last at Stone Valley. Patricia had a long memory and a longer paper trail. She had started Emily's paper trail in month 3. Minor things, at first. A note that Emily had exceeded her scope by verbally recommending a diagnostic consideration to a physician. A note that Emily had been observed reviewing patient chart data outside her assigned patient roster. A note that Emily had spent an additional 7 minutes with a patient family after her shift ended rather than handing off to the incoming nurse, which Patricia had characterized, with a straight face, as a time management concern. Emily had signed each form. She had made no argument. She had gone home, made dinner, and in the privacy of her own apartment had sat with the particular silence of someone who had survived considerably worse than a nursing director with a grudge. She had not told anyone what she had survived. That was the deal she'd made with herself when she came back. The past was the past. The service was behind her. She was a civilian now, a nurse, an ordinary person trying to do ordinary good in an ordinary place. The Black Hawk on the roof at 11:47 p.m. was about to complicate that arrangement considerably. Matrasim. The man on the gurney was 6'2" and built like someone who had spent a very long time being asked to carry heavy things under difficult conditions. His name, according to the military ID that one of the soldiers pressed into the triage nurse's hand, was Commander Marcus Webb. His rank insignia was Army Special Operations. The nature of his mission was listed on no document present in the building. The gunshot wound was upper left quadrant, entry anterior, and he had been field dressed by someone who knew what they were doing. The pressure bandage was correct. The packing placement was correct. But correct field dressing and adequate civilian trauma care were two different conversations, and the 14-minute flight from wherever they'd found him had not been kind. Emily was in the middle of charting a discharge when she heard the rotors. She had stopped typing. She had looked up at the ceiling the way you do when your body recognizes a sound before your brain does. Then she had stood, very calmly, and walked to the window. She watched the Black Hawk touch down. She knew that kind of landing. That was not a smooth landing. That was a, we don't have time for smooth landing. She was already moving toward Trauma Bay 1 when the doors came open. Dr. Briggs was already there, gloves on, calling for blood type, and a second large-bore IV. He was good in a trauma. Emily had to give him that. He moved with practiced efficiency, barking orders in the clipped shorthand of someone who had run enough of these to have the sequence memorized. The soldiers stood along the wall. They did not sit. They did not remove their gear. They watched. Emily stepped in and immediately went to the patient's right side to assist with vitals and line placement. She was halfway through positioning the blood pressure cuff when the commander's hand caught her wrist. He had been gray and barely conscious a moment ago. His eyes came open, and they were not the unfocused eyes of a man fading out. They were sharp. They found her face with a directness that felt like recognition. "Emily Dawson," he said. Emily went still. "Sir?" She kept her voice level, professional. "I need you to lie still." "You're Emily Dawson." He was not asking. His grip on her wrist was wrong, too strong for a man with that much blood loss. "Sergeant First Class Emily Dawson, 2nd Surgical, Karmali Province." The trauma bay was not quiet. There were 8 people in it, monitors alarming, someone calling out a BP reading, the particular controlled chaos of a major trauma coming through the door. But Emily heard every word he said as clearly as if the room had emptied. "Sir," she said again, and her voice did not shake, "I'm going to need you to release my arm." He released it. He did not look away from her face. Dr. Briggs had heard the last part. He looked across the gurney at Emily with an expression she couldn't quite read, somewhere between irritated and confused. And then he looked at the soldiers by the wall with the same expression, and then he looked back at his patient. "What's your relationship to the patient?" he asked Emily. "I don't have one," Emily said. "He knows your name." "I heard that." Briggs stared at her for a beat longer than was useful in an active trauma. Then he turned back to Webb and started his primary assessment, and Emily did what she was there to do. She ran the blood pressure, she checked the pulse ox, she assisted with the second IV while the other nurse on the bay managed the blood draw. She did her job. She was very good at her job, but her mind was running a parallel track underneath all of it, and the track was asking a question she had not asked herself in 4 years. How does he know that name? What? The first hour was controlled chaos, and then it wasn't. Commander Webb's blood pressure responded to the transfusion. His O2 sat stabilized. The wound tract looked clean on the initial imaging. No organ involvement, which given the entry point was a minor miracle of trajectory. And Briggs had called it a probable surgical case for the morning with monitoring through the night. Emily had stayed busy. She always stayed busy. It was the best version of being invisible. Keep moving, keep useful, and the people who wanted to look through you mostly did. She was restocking the trauma cart at 12:30 a.m. when she noticed it. The commander had been moved to a curtained bay for monitoring pending surgical consult, and Emily's assignment technically did not include him. Her assignment was the curtained bays on the other side of the unit, a fall in her 70s, a chest pain that was looking like anxious cardiac, a kid with a forearm fracture whose parents were vibrating with parental guilt. She was crossing the unit on her way back from the supply room when she passed close to Webb's bay, and she smelled it. Not blood, not the usual antiseptic overlay of a trauma bay. Something else. Something underneath. Something specific. She stopped walking. She knew that smell. She had encountered it twice before, in conditions that bore no resemblance to a civilian ER in Northern California, in circumstances she was not going to think about right now in the middle of a hospital hallway. But the olfactory memory was not something you chose to have or not have. It was just there. She turned and went to Webb's bay. The attending on the bay was not Briggs. It was the second shift physician, Dr. Yolanda Osei, who was a different kind of doctor than Briggs, quieter, more methodical. She was reviewing the imaging on a tablet at the bay's entrance. She looked up when Emily approached. "He's not your patient," Osei said. Not unkindly, just factually. "I know," Emily said. "Can I ask, has anyone done a full wound assessment? Not just the entry and exit, but the tissue around the packing?" Osei frowned. The trauma team addressed the wound on intake. "I know. I was there." Emily kept her voice even. I'd like to take a look, if you'll allow it. There's something I want to rule out." Osei looked at her for a long moment. She was the kind of doctor who did not dismiss nurses automatically, which put her in a minority in this building. "What are you thinking?" Emily told her what she was thinking. Osei's expression shifted, not dismissal, but caution. "That's a significant call based on a smell." "I know what it smells like," Emily said quietly. "I've seen it before." "Where?" Emily didn't answer that. After a moment, Osei looked back at the tablet, then at the bay, then back at Emily. "I'll have the attending take another look." The attending was Briggs. He had come back on the floor for an unrelated consult and was still at the nursing station when Osei paged him. Emily stood back while Osei laid it out. A possible secondary concern, worth ruling out, one of the ER nurses had flagged it. Briggs listened. He walked to the bay. He did his assessment with the efficiency of someone who was doing it to confirm what he already believed rather than to discover something new. Then he came back out. "Wound's clean," he said. "Standard trauma presentation. The nurse's concern is noted." The way he said "the nurse's concern" contained a very specific weight that Emily recognized. It was the weight of a characterization, not a description. The nurse. Singular. Category. "Dr. Briggs," Emily said, "if I'm right about what I smelled—" "You're not a physician," he said pleasantly. Pleasantly was the worst version of this, she had learned. Pleasant dismissal had no edge to grab onto. "You're not the attending on this patient. You're not even assigned to this section of the unit." He paused. "Stay in your lane, Ms. Dawson." He walked away. Emily stood in the hallway for 3 seconds. Then she went back to her assigned patients. She was checking in on the chest pain in Bay 7 when Patricia Sloan appeared in the unit at 1:15 a.m., which was unusual because Patricia's shift did not include 1:15 a.m. Patricia ran days and administrative evenings. She was not an overnight presence. Emily noticed her arrival. She finished her assessment, updated her chart note, and then went to restock the medication cart, which happened to take her past the nursing station where Patricia was in quiet, pointed conversation with the charge nurse. She couldn't hear the words. She didn't need to. Patricia's eyes found her across the unit, and the look was not confused or casual. It was the look of someone who had already made a decision and was now taking stock of what they were looking at. Emily went back to the medication cart. Tom, at 2 a.m., Commander Webb's blood pressure dropped. Not catastrophically, not the kind of drop that fires alarms and brings everyone running. The kind of drop that is subtle enough to attribute to normal post-trauma fluctuation if you are inclined to attribute it to something benign. A 4-point fall over 30 minutes. Easy to miss if you weren't watching. Emily was watching. Not because it was her assignment, but because she had positioned herself at the nursing station with her charting in a way that gave her a sightline to Webb's monitoring data. She had been watching it for 40 minutes. She flagged Dr. Osei at 2:03. Osei came. She looked at the trend. Her expression was controlled, but her eyes were focused in a way that meant she was recalibrating something. She ordered a repeat CBC and a temperature check. The temperature came back at 100 to 1.8. That was not in the chart from intake. Osei looked at the number. She looked at Emily. "Get Briggs," she said. Briggs arrived irritated because being paged at 2 a.m. for a patient he'd already signed off on was not his preference. He reviewed the new data. He did not look at Emily. "Fever's not unusual post-trauma," he said. "We'll monitor." "Dr. Briggs." Emily's voice was still even, still professional. She had not yet crossed any line on paper. "I want to formally document a concern about possible battlefield-acquired infection, specifically Ms. Dawson." He turned then. The pleasantness was gone now, not replaced by anger, but by something flatter. "You've raised this concern. It's been evaluated. The attending's assessment stands." He looked at Osei. "If the fever spikes, repage me." He looked back at Emily. "I'm going to have a conversation with Director Sloan in the morning about appropriate nursing protocol." He left. Osei watched him go. She looked at Emily. She didn't say anything, but she didn't leave either. She pulled up Webb's chart and started adding a note, and her fingers were moving with the particular deliberateness of someone who wanted what they were doing to be on record. Emily appreciated that. She filed it away. At 2:30 a.m., Patricia Sloan came to find her. She did not come to the nursing station. She came to the hallway outside Bay 4, where Emily was doing a reassessment on the fall patient, 73 years old, Mrs. Greta Holloway, who had been awake and frightened, and whom Emily had been talking through the night in the quiet moments between everything else. "Dawson," Patricia said from the doorway. Emily finished what she was doing. She squeezed Mrs. Holloway's hand. "I'll be right back," she said, and the old woman nodded and held on for just a moment longer than necessary, and Emily did not rush the handoff. She came to the hallway. Patricia Sloan was 61, silver-haired, efficient in the way of someone who had been efficient for so long it had calcified into something harder. She held a tablet. On the tablet was a form Emily recognized. "I'm initiating a temporary suspension of your floor privileges pending a formal conduct review," Patricia said. "Effective end of this shift." Emily looked at the form. Then she looked at Patricia. "On what grounds?" "Repeated failure to maintain scope of practice, interference with physician care plans, creating a disruptive environment in the trauma unit." Patricia's voice was level, practiced. She had done this before. This follows multiple documented incidents over the past 14 months. "None of those incidents involved patient harm," Emily said. "The potential for harm. I'm documenting a concern about a patient with a possible combat-acquired infection and a rising fever. That's not outside my scope. That's a nursing assessment." "The attending has reviewed and addressed the concern." Emily looked at her. "Has he?" Patricia's expression did not change. "Sign the acknowledgement form, Dawson. You'll be escorted from the floor at end of shift." Emily looked at the tablet. She thought about 14 months of signed forms. She thought about the paper trail Patricia had been building since month 3. She thought about Dr. Briggs and his pleasantness, and his stay in your lane, and the way he had not looked at her when he delivered it, because looking required acknowledging that she existed in a dimension he did not wish to engage with. She thought about the temperature reading. She thought about the smells she had not misidentified. "I need to finish my patient assessments," Emily said. "You can hand off to—" "I need to finish my assessments," Emily said again, and something in her voice had changed. Not raised, not aggressive, but settled in a way that was different from the tone she had been using for 14 months. Mrs. Holloway in Bay 4 is elderly and disoriented, and she's been asking for me specifically for the past 3 hours. I'm not leaving her mid-shift without a proper handoff. That would be a patient safety issue. Would you like to document that you requested I do it anyway? Patricia looked at her for a long moment. End of shift, Patricia said. Not 1 minute passed. She left. Emily went back to Bay 4, Mrs. Holloway was watching her with eyes that were alert despite everything, the kind of alertness that comes from a lifetime of reading rooms. Trouble? Mrs. Holloway said. Nothing I can't manage, Emily said, and it was possibly the most honest thing she'd said to anyone in this building in 14 months. At 3:15 a.m., the soldiers in the hallway stopped being stationary. There were 3 of them. Emily had counted on her first pass through the unit. 2 had positioned themselves near the elevator bank. 1 had been near Webb's Bay. Now they were converging, and the convergence was quiet and deliberate, and it was moving toward the nursing station where the charge nurse was on the phone. Emily was at the medication cart. She watched. The charge nurse, Kevin, 26 years old, 2 years out of nursing school, a good nurse who was badly overmatched by what was happening in his unit tonight, looked up from the phone with an expression that had several layers of stress in it and said, Ms. Dawson, the patient in Bay 3 is asking for you. Bay 3 was Webb's Bay. Emily went. The soldier nearest the entrance, the one who had been maintaining position there since intake, gave her a look as she approached. Not hostile, evaluating. She met it without flinching and went through the curtain. Webb was worse. The gray had deepened. His breathing had changed. Not critical, not yet, but the quality of it was different from 2 hours ago. He was conscious, but the consciousness had a held quality to it, like a man exerting significant effort to stay on the right side of a line. His eyes found her immediately. You stayed, he said. I'm working a shift, Emily said. She went to the monitor, checked the readings, noted the temperature, 102.4 now. She kept her face neutral. They're going to pull you off this floor, he said. Not a question. I'm aware. Don't let them. Emily looked at him. Sir, I need to check your wound site. I know what's wrong with me, he said. His voice had the particular flatness of someone reporting facts rather than experiencing distress. I've had it before. Different strain, same mechanism. If you let Briggs handle it with a standard antibiotic protocol, I'll be septic by morning. Emily stood very still. How do you know that? She said carefully. Because I've been in enough field conditions to recognize it when it starts. And because the last person who caught it early enough to matter was a 24-year-old combat medic in a fire base outside a city I still can't name in mixed company. His eyes held hers. She had the same look you have right now, same way of standing, like she was doing the math and didn't like the answer, but was going to act on it anyway. The hallway outside was quiet for a moment. Emily could hear Kevin on the phone again, and the distant sound of monitors, and somewhere down the hall, Mrs. Holloway's call light going on. You need to be treated, Emily said. I'm going to document a formal escalation and request an infectious disease consult. And if Briggs blocks it? Emily looked at the monitor, at the numbers trending the wrong direction with the slow, inevitable quality of something that had already decided where it was going. She looked at the curtain. Through it, in the hallway, she could feel the presence of the soldiers and Patricia's suspended shift deadline and 14 months of signed forms and the particular weight of being the person in the room who knew something that no one was willing to hear. She looked back at Webb. Then I'll accept the consequences later, she said. Right now, you need treatment. She walked out of the bay and went to find what she needed. She did not ask permission. The supply room on the 3rd floor was not part of Emily's assigned section, but she knew where it was because she had made it her business, early in her time at Stone Valley, to know where everything was. Not for any particular reason. Just because knowing where things were was a habit she had developed in environments where not knowing could cost you. She pulled what she needed with the efficiency of someone who had learned to work fast in bad light, under pressure, with the specific understanding that the window for action was narrowing and every second spent hesitating was a second spent losing ground. 2 items. 1, a medication that was on the unit's formulary but required attending authorization for use. 1, a testing kit that the ER kept for rare occasions, and that had not been opened in, based on the dust on the packaging, a considerable amount of time. She was back on the unit in 4 minutes. Kevin at the nursing station watched her cross the floor with an expression that was one part concern and two parts the particular helplessness of a young nurse who understood that something significant was happening but could not identify which side of it he was supposed to be on. She did not stop to explain. Explanation was a luxury for situations where you had the time for it. Dr. Osei was at the workstation near Bay 2. She looked up when Emily set the testing kit on the counter. "I need you to authorize this," Emily said. Osei looked at the kit. She looked at Emily. "Briggs already—" "I know what Briggs said. His temperature is 102.4 and climbing. The trend over the last 90 minutes is not consistent with standard post-trauma fever." Emily kept her voice flat, factual, stripped of everything that wasn't information. "This kit will give us a preliminary result in 8 minutes. If I'm wrong, it costs us 8 minutes and a piece of equipment we weren't using anyway. And if you're right, then we've been 8 minutes ahead of sepsis instead of 8 minutes behind it." Osei was quiet for a moment that was longer than 8 minutes felt, but was probably 4 seconds. She was doing the same math Emily had done and arriving at the same place, but she was also doing a different calculation, the one that factored in Briggs and Patricia Sloan, and what it meant to authorize a diagnostic that your senior attending had already dismissed. "I'll run it," Osei said finally, "under my authorization." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." Osei picked up the kit. "If this comes back negative, we're both having a very bad morning." Emily followed her to Webb's Bay. He was awake. He tracked their entry with eyes that were still sharp underneath the fatigue and the fever warmth that had started to settle into his face. He did not speak. He had the quality, Emily had noticed, of someone accustomed to receiving information rather than demanding it. A patience that was not passive but coiled. The patience of someone who had spent years in situations where talking more than necessary was a liability. Osei ran the test. Emily held the timer. The 8 minutes were not quiet. 2 minutes in, Kevin appeared at the curtain to tell Emily that Patricia Sloan had called from somewhere and wanted confirmation that Emily was completing her handoffs and preparing to leave at shift end. Emily told Kevin to tell Director Sloan she was assisting with a patient assessment and would check in at the appropriate time. Kevin's expression suggested he found this answer inadequate, but he went to deliver it anyway, because Kevin was fundamentally a person who delivered messages rather than stopped them. 4 minutes in, one of the soldiers, the one who had been nearest Webb's Bay, stepped partially through the curtain. He looked at Osei. He looked at Emily. He looked at Webb. "Commander," he said. Just that. "I'm aware," Webb said. His voice was rougher than it had been an hour ago. The soldier stepped back out. 6 minutes in, Emily heard Briggs' voice in the hallway. Not directed at anyone near them. He was on the phone, moving through the unit on some other errand. But the sound of it tightened something in the room, a collectively held breath, the awareness that the window for the next 8 minutes to mean anything was going to close if he came through that curtain before the timer went off. He didn't. His voice faded toward the elevator bank. The timer went off at 8 minutes and 14 seconds. Osei looked at the result. She was still for a moment that Emily felt in her chest. "Get the cart," Osei said. Her voice had changed. The caution was gone, replaced by something cleaner. The voice of a doctor who had just been handed a clear task. "And Page Pharmacy for a combat spectrum protocol." Emily moved. She did not allow herself to feel anything about being right. Being right was not the point. The point was what happened next, and what happened next required her to move quickly and cleanly, and without the kind of emotional overhead that slowed things down. There would be time later to feel things, or there wouldn't be, and that would be its own answer. The treatment took 40 minutes to initiate properly. Osei ran point. Emily assisted with the kind of precise, wordless coordination that happens between people who are focused on the same thing. No wasted motion, no redundant communication, just the work. Webb tolerated it with the grim cooperation of a man who had been through enough medical procedures in difficult circumstances that the indignity of them no longer registered. At one point, midway through, he said, "You didn't leave." "No," Emily said. "They told you to." "Shift's not over." He was quiet for a moment, then, "That's not why." Emily did not answer that. By 4:20 a.m., his numbers had stopped moving in the wrong direction. By 4:40, they had begun, incrementally and without drama, to reverse. Not recovered. That was not a 40-minute process, but stabilized. The downward trend arrested, the fever holding rather than climbing, the blood pressure finding a floor and staying there. Osei documented everything, every reading, every intervention, every timestamp. She did it with the particular thoroughness of someone who understood that documentation was not paperwork but armor, and that the morning was coming, and that what happened in the next few hours was going to require a paper record that could not be argued with. Emily noticed. She added her own nursing notes with the same thoroughness. Then Patricia Sloan came through the unit doors. It was 4:55 a.m. Shift change was at 7. Emily's suspension from floor privileges was supposed to take effect at end of shift, which Patricia had defined as the end of Emily's scheduled hours. Emily's scheduled hours ended at 7. That Patricia was here at 4:55 meant something had changed. Patricia was not alone. She had the hospital's overnight security supervisor with her, a heavy-set man named Gary who Emily had encountered twice before, and who had the bearing of someone who had been woken from sleep and had not yet achieved full coherence. And she had a printed form in her hand that Emily recognized as a different form than the one from earlier. This was not a suspension form. This was an immediate removal order. Patricia stopped outside Webb's Bay. She looked through the curtain gap at Osei and Emily and the monitoring equipment and the IV lines and the organized evidence of 40 minutes of active treatment. Her expression did not shift, but something behind her eyes did. "Dr. Osei?" she said. "A word." Osei came to the curtain. She did not step all the way out. "Director Sloan, we're in the middle of active monitoring on a critical patient." "I understand. This will be brief." Patricia's eyes moved to Emily. "Ms. Dawson, you're being removed from the floor effective immediately. Conduct issues that I don't have the latitude to delay further." "What conduct issues?" Osei said. "That's an administrative matter." "She's been assisting me with a patient who just tested positive for a combat-acquired infection that Dr. Briggs missed on initial assessment." Osei's voice was even, more even, Emily thought, than it probably felt. Removing her from the floor right now in the middle of active treatment would be— "Removing her is within my authority as nursing director," Patricia said. "The patient care can be managed by the incoming shift. The incoming shift doesn't know this patient. They'll be briefed." The two of them looked at each other. It was the particular collision of two kinds of institutional authority, medical and administrative, that had been bumping against each other in hospitals for as long as hospitals had existed, and it never resolved cleanly because the power was distributed in ways that didn't make logical sense, but made perfect political sense. Emily stood inside the bay and watched through the gap in the curtain and did not speak. She was calculating. One of the soldiers had materialized at the edge of the hallway. He was not intervening. He was present, which was its own form of intervention. Patricia noticed him. Her posture changed slightly, not visibly to someone who wasn't watching for it, but Emily was watching for it. A minor recalibration, the awareness of an audience. "Ms. Dawson," Patricia said, addressing her through the curtain now, "please collect your personal items and proceed to the exit." Emily looked at Webb. His eyes were open. He had been following the conversation with the focused attention of a man who was tracking tactical information in a hostile environment, which, Emily reflected, was probably not entirely unlike what he was used to. He gave her a look that was not quite a nod. It was the look of someone who was saying, "I've got it from here," which was either reassuring or terrifying depending on what it meant. Emily stepped through the curtain. "I'll need to complete a nursing handoff note before I go," she said to Patricia. "Patient safety requirement. It will take 10 minutes. Patricia held the immediate removal form out to her. "Sign first." Emily looked at the form. She looked at Patricia. She thought about 14 months. She thought about every signed form, every documented incident, every note in a file that had been building toward this moment with the patient accumulation of someone who had been planning the end of something for a very long time. She thought about the testing kit, the timestamp on Osei's authorization, the treatment record that was currently being built in Webb's chart with Osei's name on it and Emily's nursing notes underneath. She signed the form. 10 minutes, she said. Patricia watched her go to the nursing station. Gary, the security supervisor, stood near the elevator with his hands at his sides, not quite guarding, not quite not. Emily sat down. She opened Webb's chart. She began typing. She was not writing a handoff note. She was writing the most thorough, precise, clinically detailed nursing assessment she had ever produced in 14 months at Stone Valley Medical Center, documenting every observation, every concern raised and dismissed, every timestamp, every data point that told the story of what had happened in this unit between 11:47 p.m. and 4:55 a.m. She wrote it in the flat, factual, inarguable language of clinical documentation. No editorializing, no emotion, just data and time and observed fact. She finished in 9 minutes and 40 seconds. She logged out of the system. She picked up her bag from the break room. She was at the elevator when Kevin stopped her. He was trying to keep his face neutral and failing, which meant he had heard more of the hallway conversation than he'd intended to and was now carrying it around with the discomfort of someone who knew too much and was too early in their career to know what to do with it. "Emily," he said. She looked at him. "For what it's worth," he said, and then he stopped because saying what it was worth out loud in a hallway at 5 a.m. where anyone could hear was a different kind of risk than just feeling it. "It's worth something," she said. "Get some sleep when your shift ends." She got in the elevator. The doors closed. She stood in the descending elevator and allowed herself, for the first time since 11:47 p.m., to feel the full weight of what the last 5 hours had been. It arrived the way exhaustion always does when you've been holding it at bay. Not gradually, but all at once, like a door coming off its hinges. Her hands, she noticed, were steady. They were always steady when it mattered. It was after that they shook. The lobby was nearly empty. Early morning, the hour between the end of the night shift's worst crises and the beginning of the day's first arrivals. A security guard at the desk. A family in the far corner, the posture of people who had been waiting a long time and had stopped expecting the wait to end. Emily walked through the sliding doors into the pre-dawn dark. The air outside was cold and damp, the particular cold of coastal California before sunrise, carrying the faint smell of eucalyptus and rain-washed pavement. She stopped outside the entrance and stood for a moment and did not think about anything she was supposed to think about. She thought about Mrs. Holloway, who would wake up in a few hours and ask for her, and be told she was gone. She thought about Webb's temperature reading at 4:40, holding at 102.1 instead of climbing to 103.5 the way it had been trending before treatment. She thought about the nursing notes sitting in his chart under her login credentials, with timestamps that could not be altered. Then she thought about the form she had signed. And she thought about what Patricia Sloan had said, "Conduct issues that I don't have the latitude to delay further. Not conduct issues that arose tonight, not conduct issues resulting from tonight's events. Issues she didn't have the latitude to delay." Delay implied a timeline, a decision already made and held waiting for the right moment. The right moment being, Emily understood now, the moment when something happened that Patricia needed to control the narrative around before anyone else could define it. She stood in the cold for another minute. Then she took out her phone and sent a text to the only attorney whose number she had saved under a label that was not their name. She typed, "It happened. I need you in the morning." She put the phone in her pocket. She was halfway to her car when the hospital's front doors slid open again behind her. She turned. It was not Patricia. It was not Gary. It was not Kevin. It was one of the soldiers, the one who had been near Webb's Bay, the one who had looked at her with the evaluating gaze earlier. He was in full gear, carrying himself with the controlled economy of movement that Emily recognized from a specific context she had spent 4 years trying to leave behind. He stopped a few feet from her. The parking lot lights caught the side of his face, young, maybe 28, with the particular weathered quality around the eyes that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with what he'd seen. "Ms. Dawson," he said. "Sergeant," she said, because she could tell by the way he carried himself, and he registered the word without reacting. "The commander wanted me to give you something." He held out a folded piece of paper. Not a document, something written by hand, the paper from a hospital notepad, the kind that sits on bedside tables. Emily took it. She did not open it. "He also wanted you to know," the soldier said, "that Colonel Reeves lands at 0800. Emily went still. She knew that name. She had not heard it in 4 years. She had not expected to hear it again. "What does Colonel Reeves want?" she said, and her voice was careful and flat in a way that the soldier clearly recognized, because he responded to it the way you respond to someone who understands the register you're speaking in. "Not what he wants, ma'am," the soldier said. "What he knows, and what he's been asked to bring with him." He held her gaze for a moment. "The commander said you'd understand." He went back inside. Emily stood in the parking lot with the folded piece of paper in her hand and the cold air moving around her and the sky beginning very faintly to change at the eastern edge. Not light yet, but the suggestion of it. The early warning before the actual thing arrived. She opened the paper. Webb's handwriting was unsteady, the handwriting of a man who had written it while lying down, probably while Osei's back was turned. But legible. 4 lines. "They have your file, Dawson. The real one. Sloan requested your records from HR 6 weeks ago. I don't think she found what she was looking for, but Reeves is bringing what she should have found. This isn't over for them, but it isn't over for us either." Emily read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket with her phone and stood in the parking lot and thought about what it meant that Patricia Sloan had pulled her personnel file 6 weeks ago, 6 weeks before tonight, before the Blackhawk, before any of this, and thought about what was in that file and what was not in that file, and what Colonel Reeves might be carrying in a briefcase on a plane that was landing in 4 hours. Her hands were shaking now, not from fear, from something that felt, after 14 months of being invisible in a building full of people, dangerously close to the opposite of fear. She didn't go home. She sat in her car in the Stone Valley parking lot for 11 minutes, engine off, hands in her lap, watching the sky at the eastern edge do what it had been threatening to do. Go from suggestion to certainty. The dark breaking apart in thin horizontal strips of gray and pale amber that had nothing poetic about them and everything practical, the way dawn usually was when you'd been up all night doing something that mattered. Then she drove to a diner on Route 9 called Paulie's that opened at 5 and served coffee that was not good but was hot and arrived in large quantities without being asked. And she sat in a booth by the window and opened her phone. The attorney she had texted was a woman named Doris Falk. Doris was 54, practiced employment and civil rights law out of a 3-person firm in Mill Haven, and had been recommended to Emily 11 months ago by a coworker who had since left Stone Valley under circumstances that were not coincidental. Emily had called Doris after the 3rd documented incident in her file. She had called her again after the 6th. They had a relationship that was not friendship, but was built on the same material as friendship: honesty, mutual respect, and the shared understanding that what was happening at Stone Valley was not random. Doris texted back at 5:22 a.m. "Already up. Call me." Emily called. She laid it out in the order it had happened, without editorializing, the same way she wrote clinical notes: time, event, observed fact. Doris did not interrupt. Emily could hear her writing on the other end, the scratch of a pen, which Doris still preferred to typing for initial notes because she said it made her listen better. When Emily finished, Doris was quiet for a moment. "The nursing notes you entered before you left," she said. "They're time-stamped and in the system." "Yes." "And Osei's authorization for the diagnostic is documented." "Yes." "Okay." Another pause. "The note from the commander. Don't lose that. Don't photograph it. Keep the original. Physical chain of custody matters." "I know." "I know you know." Doris's voice was dry but not unkind. "Who is Colonel Reeves?" Emily looked at her coffee. "Someone I served under," she said, which was accurate and also incomplete in about 14 different directions, none of which she was going to travel down on a phone call at 5:22 a.m. in a diner on Route 9. "And what is he bringing?" "I don't know exactly." That was true. But if it's what I think it is, it changes the context of everything. Doris made a sound that was not agreement, but was the sound of a lawyer updating her internal model of a case. "I'm going to make some calls this morning, before 800. If federal personnel are arriving at that hospital with documentation related to a patient and to you, that's a different kind of morning than Patricia Sloan is currently planning for." "I think that's right," Emily said. "Get some sleep if you can." "I can't." Eat something then. Emily ordered eggs she didn't particularly want and ate half of them because Doris was correct, functionally, even if the suggestion landed with the particular flatness of practical advice delivered to someone operating on adrenaline and very little else. Then she drove home, showered, changed, and was back in her car by 7:40. She did not go back to Stone Valley. Not yet. She parked across the street from the main entrance, in the lot of a pharmacy that wouldn't open until 9, and she watched the building from a distance she judged as appropriate. At 7:58, a black SUV with government plates pulled into the hospital's reserved parking, then a second one, then a third. 3 vehicles. That was not one colonel arriving for a conversation. That was a delegation. Emily's phone buzzed. Doris. On my way. Do not go inside without me. Buzz. Colonel Margaret Reeves was 57 years old, and she walked like someone who had long ago stopped caring what walking looked like to other people and started caring only about where she was going. She was in civilian clothes, dark slacks, a jacket that was neither formal nor casual, the particular middle register of someone who had been in enough rooms to know that the clothes were never actually the point. She carried a briefcase that was not decorative. She had 2 people with her, a man in his 30s who moved with the same quality as the soldiers who had arrived with Webb, and a woman in a charcoal suit who was almost certainly not military and almost certainly was legal. They went through Stone Valley's main entrance at 8:03. Emily watched from across the street. At 8:09, Doris Falk pulled up beside Emily's car, got out, and knocked on the passenger window. Emily unlocked the door. Doris was a large woman with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a coat that had seen better years, and a briefcase that was, unlike Reeves, entirely decorative. She kept her actual documents in a canvas tote that said Millhaven Public Library on the side. She dropped into the passenger seat and looked at the hospital entrance. 3 vehicles, Emily said. I see that. Doris reached into the canvas tote and pulled out a folder. I made some calls at 6 a.m. I have a contact at the federal level who knows about active military personnel being treated at civilian hospitals. There are protocols for that, and those protocols include certain notifications that go up a chain that does not include Patricia Sloan. She opened the folder. The interesting thing is that those notifications, in this case, were filed 18 hours ago, before the Black Hawk landed. Emily turned to look at her. Someone knew he was coming here, Doris said, and someone made sure the right people knew what to have ready when he did. Emily said nothing for a moment. Outside, a morning shift nurse Emily recognized was walking across the parking lot toward the entrance, coffee cup in hand, unaware. Normal morning, except for the 3 government vehicles in the reserved lot. We're going in, Doris said. It was not a question. Yes, Emily said, together. Yes? Doris put the folder back in the tote. One more thing. She looked at Emily with the directness she had demonstrated in every conversation they'd had, the directness of someone who respected the person she was talking to enough not to soften what needed to be said straight. Whatever's in that briefcase, whatever Reeves brought, I need you to understand that it may make things better, and it will almost certainly, in the short term, make things harder. The people who tried to end your career in there are going to be cornered, and cornered people do damage. I know, Emily said. I know you know, Doris said again, and this time it didn't sound dry. It sounded like something closer to solidarity. They crossed the street together. The lobby of Stone Valley Medical Center at 8:15 a.m. was in a state that could only be described as institutionally disrupted. The normal morning shift energy, purposeful, harried, the organized urgency of a hospital coming online, had been overlaid with something else, a current of uncertainty that Emily could feel in the way the desk staff were positioned, the way 2 administrators were conferring near the elevator with the body language of people who had received information they had not yet figured out how to act on. Patricia Sloan was in the lobby. She saw Emily come through the doors. The expression on her face went through several things in rapid succession. Surprise, then a recalibration, then the particular controlled arrangement of someone who had decided to behave as if they were still in the superior position even as the evidence around them was beginning to suggest otherwise. She looked at Doris, at the tote bag. Something shifted in her jaw. Ms. Dawson, she said, you've been removed from this facility pending the outcome of a conduct review. You do not have authorization to be on the premises. My client is here in response to matters arising from her employment at this institution, Doris said pleasantly. She has every right to be present with legal representation during any investigative proceedings that involve her. There are no investigative proceedings. There will be, Doris said, still pleasant. The pleasantness of someone who had all morning and a full folder of documentation and nowhere she'd rather be. Patricia looked from Doris to Emily and back. The lobby was not private. 2 nurses from the day shift were near the desk and making no effort to appear as though they weren't listening. The administrator pair by the elevator had stopped conferring. This is not the appropriate venue for this conversation, Patricia said. No, Doris agreed. The appropriate venue is probably going to be determined by whoever's upstairs. She nodded toward the elevator. Shall we? Patricia did not answer, but she moved toward the elevator, which was its own answer. They went up to the 6th floor, which housed the administrative offices, and also, Emily noted, the ICU, where Webb had been moved after stabilization. The 6th floor was also where 3 people from the government SUVs were currently doing something that had caused Dr. Briggs to be standing in the hallway outside his own department, with the expression of a man who had arrived at a meeting to discover he was the subject of it, rather than a participant. Emily looked at Briggs. He looked at Emily. He looked at Doris. He looked at the floor. Colonel Reeves was in the ICU, not in Webb's room, in the consultation space adjacent to it, a glassed-off room that had been quietly commandeered, and through the glass, Emily could see Reeves at the table with the woman in the charcoal suit and one of the hospital's senior administrators, a man named Gerald Park, who was the deputy director and whose presence meant that whatever was happening had already escalated past the level that Patricia Sloan was equipped to manage. Park saw Emily in the hallway. He said something to Reeves. Reeves looked up. She had not seen Reeves in 4 years. In that time, Reeves had gone grayer, the lines around her eyes deeper, but the fundamental quality of her gaze had not changed. It was the gaze of someone who processed information at a pace that made most conversations feel like they were happening in slow motion for her. Reeves stood. She came to the glass door and opened it. She did not smile, but her voice, when she spoke, was the voice of someone who was choosing her words to convey something that ceremony would handle incorrectly. "Sergeant Dawson," she said. Emily had not been called that in 4 years. "Colonel," she said. Reeves looked at Doris. "Counsel?" "Doris Falk," Doris said. "Employment and civil rights." "Good." Reeves opened the door wider. "Come in, both of you." Patricia Sloan moved to follow. "Director Sloan?" Reeves said, and her voice did not raise but acquired a quality that stopped Patricia mid-step. "Not yet. I'll let you know when we're ready for you." The door closed. What followed in that room was 40 minutes that Emily would spend a long time afterward unable to fully reconstruct in linear sequence, because it arrived not as a narrative but as a series of facts delivered in rapid succession by people who had been waiting to deliver them and had no intention of being gradual about it. The briefcase contained a service record, not the redacted version that Emily had submitted to Stone Valley's HR department when she applied, the version that listed her service dates and her general designation and the 4-year gap that Patricia Sloan had circled in red, but the actual record. Classification level that the woman in the charcoal suit, who was a JAG attorney named Watkins, explained had been partially declassified 48 hours ago at Commander Webb's formal request, pending his medical status and the circumstances of his admission. The service record showed that Emily Marie Dawson, then Sergeant First Class, had served 2 tours as a combat medic attached to a Special Operations Support Unit. It showed her commendations, including 2 she had not known were in her file because they had been classified above the level of information she was permitted to review about herself. It showed, in clinical military language, the events of a night in a location listed by coordinates rather than name, during which Sergeant Dawson had maintained medical care for 3 critically wounded operators under active fire conditions for a period of 4 hours and 11 minutes until extraction was possible. One of those operators had been a then-Captain Marcus Webb. Emily sat at the table and looked at a document describing her own life in a register so far from personal that it might have been describing a stranger, except that she remembered every minute of those 4 hours and 11 minutes, and the document was accurate. Reeves had been watching her. "You know why I'm here," Reeves said. It was not a question. Some of it, Emily said. All of it, I think. Reeves opened a second folder. 6 weeks ago, Patricia Sloan submitted a formal records inquiry to an employment verification firm. She was attempting to obtain your full service record to use as justification for termination. Specifically, she was operating on the assumption that your military record contained a disciplinary action or an administrative separation that she could leverage. Emily said nothing, because that was what Patricia had been looking for. Something to end this with cleanly and permanently. She didn't find one, Reeves said. No, Emily said. She wouldn't. What she found instead was a classified designation with no accessible detail, which frustrated her, but which she apparently decided to ignore rather than report through proper channels. Because reporting through proper channels would have required her to explain why she was running background inquiries on an active employee outside of standard HR procedure. Doris, beside Emily, was writing. She also, Watkins said, picking up with the precision of someone taking a relay baton, submitted 3 separate complaints to the nursing board in your name over the past 8 months. 2 were dismissed without investigation. The 3rd is currently pending, and was, we believe, timed to coincide with tonight's events. Emily felt something move through her that was not surprise. It was the sensation of a picture she had already been forming in her mind acquiring its final details, the shape of something becoming fully visible. She knew something was going to happen tonight, Emily said. She didn't know the specifics, Watkins said, but she's been building toward a termination event for months. Tonight gave her a reason to accelerate it. Why? Doris asked. What's her stake in Emily being gone? The room was quiet for a moment. It was Reeves who answered, and she answered with the directness of someone delivering information that had its own weight and didn't require decoration. Because 8 months ago, a different nurse in this department, a nurse named Cara Mendez, filed an internal complaint alleging that a pattern of retaliatory conduct by hospital administration had resulted in patient harm. That complaint was suppressed internally. Mendez subsequently resigned. Before she left, she gave a copy of the complaint to one person she trusted. Reeves looked at Emily. The hospital's systems were audited last month as part of a broader inquiry into the incident that prompted Mendez to file. Your nursing notes appeared in that audit, multiple instances over 14 months, where your documented assessments flagged clinical concerns that were subsequently validated by outcomes. You were, without knowing it, creating a record of the pattern Mendez described. Emily sat with that. She had not known about Mendez's complaint. She had known about Mendez. The woman had been warm, careful, skilled, and then she had been gone one Monday morning with no explanation given to the floor staff. But she had not known about the complaint. Patricia needed that record gone, Emily said. Not just me, the notes. Yes, Reeves said, except that medical records in an electronic system are not gone when an employee is removed. They're still there, still time-stamped, still attached to patient charts. A pause. She didn't think that through fully. Doris made a sound that was part legal satisfaction and part something more personal. Then the door opened. It was Kevin. He looked like he had not slept, which he hadn't, and he looked like he had made a decision, which he had. He was holding a printout. I'm sorry to interrupt, he said, and he was talking to the room but looking at Emily. I thought someone should know. There's footage. He put the printout on the table. It was a screenshot, time-stamped 3:08 a.m. I pulled it this morning before the day shift came on. The security cameras on the 6th floor have a coverage gap between 2:45 and 4, but the camera on the stairwell landing doesn't go through the same system, and it doesn't have the same gap. Reeves picked up the printout. The screenshot showed Patricia Sloan in the stairwell at 3:08 a.m. on the phone. Next to her was a man Emily recognized as the hospital's head of risk management, a man named Dennis Holbrook, who was not supposed to be in the building at 3 a.m. on any basis. Audio? Watkins asked. The stairwell camera isn't audio-enabled, Kevin said, but the timestamp puts Director Sloan in the stairwell for 22 minutes, starting 9 minutes after Dr. Osei authorized Emily's diagnostic and 11 minutes after Emily began treatment on Commander Webb. No one in the room said anything for a moment. Then Reeves said very quietly, "Get Director Sloan." Kevin nodded and left. Reeves looked at the printout for another moment, then set it down with the controlled care of someone handling something they intended to keep. She looked at Emily. "Marcus Webb is awake," she said. "He's been awake for about an hour. He wants to speak with you." Emily looked at the door, then back at Reeves. "Now?" "When you're ready." Reeves paused. "He's also recorded a formal statement this morning, witnessed by Watkins and one of my staff. In it, he describes the events of 4 years ago in detail, including your specific actions and the outcome. That statement, combined with the declassified record, constitutes the official account." She paused again. "He was very clear about one thing. He said, and I'm quoting, 'I want her to know that I didn't forget. I want that on the record.'" Emily looked at the table. At the service record with her name on it in military type, the document describing 4 hours and 11 minutes that she had spent 4 years not talking about. "Okay," she said. Her voice was steady. It was always steady when it mattered. She stood. She was almost to the door when Watkins said, "Miss Dawson?" Emily turned. Watkins had a particular expression, not warm exactly, but specific. The expression of someone who had spent a career in institutions and had learned to recognize when an institution had done something that required acknowledgement. "The complaint pending before the nursing board will be filing a response by end of business today. Based on the timeline and documentation, we expect it to be dismissed within the week." Emily nodded. She went into the hallway. Dr. Briggs was still there. He had been there this whole time, standing in the hallway outside his department with his hospital ID clipped to his breast pocket at exactly the right angle, and he looked like a man who had been given a great deal of time to think and had not enjoyed any of it. He looked at her. She looked at him. She did not say anything. She had nothing to say to Nathan Briggs that the morning had not already said more efficiently. She walked past him toward Webb's room. She was 3 steps from the door when she heard, behind her, the sound of the consultation room door opening and Reeves's voice saying, "Director Sloan, sit down, please." And the sound of Patricia's voice beginning something that was cut off with the clean efficiency of a door closing on a conversation that had just become something Patricia Sloan was not going to be able to end on her own terms. Emily pushed open the door to Webb's room. He was propped up, less gray than he had been at midnight, the fever having broken sometime in the early morning hours with the cooperation of the treatment that should have started 6 hours earlier than it did. He looked like a man who had been through something and had decided to be functional about it. His eyes came to her immediately. She stood in the doorway. He said, "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't," she said. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He looked at her for a moment with the same directness he'd had since the moment his eyes had found her in the trauma bay at midnight, the directness of someone who was not going to perform casualness about something that was not casual. "I wrote a statement this morning," he said. "I know. It covers everything, what you did, where, the outcome." He paused. "The Army should have done this 4 years ago. The classification was... There were reasons for it, and I understood the reasons, but you deserved the record." He stopped. "I'm sorry it took this." Emily looked at him. She thought about what to say and landed on honesty, which was what she usually landed on when the other options ran out. "It didn't break me," she said. "The waiting." "I know." He said it without sentimentality, which was the correct way to say it. "That's the part they don't understand about you, the people in this building." He glanced toward the door. "They thought silence meant nothing. They didn't consider that some people are quiet because they're doing math." Emily almost smiled. Not quite. "Reeves is with Sloan now," she said. "I know. I asked her to wait until you'd had a chance to hear it first." He shifted slightly, the careful movement of a man with a wound that reminded him of itself with every change in position. "There's more. Watkins will brief you on the full scope, but the inquiry that's already been running, it's not just Mendez's complaint. There's financial misconduct, billing fraud, staff retaliation over a period of years." His eyes were steady. "Patricia Sloan has been running this department like a private operation for a long time. You were never the target specifically. You were a variable she needed to eliminate before the investigation found you and asked you what you'd seen." Emily thought about 14 months of signed forms. Every small indignity, every documented incident, Every morning she had driven to work and sat in the parking lot for an extra minute before going inside. She thought about the paper trail Patricia had been building. She thought about the paper trail she had been building without ever naming it that in her nursing notes. "How much does Holbrook know?" she asked. Webb looked at her. The fact that she'd asked about Holbrook rather than reacting to what he'd just told her said something she didn't articulate and he didn't require articulation of. "Everything Sloan knows," he said. "Watkins thinks he was the one who pulled the internal security footage gap, created it, not just exploited it. He has access to those systems. She thinks it was done specifically for tonight." Emily absorbed that. "They knew you were coming," she said. "Someone in the administrative chain knew a military patient was incoming. Not the specifics, not me, not the urgency, but enough to want the unit managed." He paused. "Enough to want you off the floor before anything could happen that they couldn't control." The room was quiet for a moment. Somewhere down the hall, Emily could hear voices. Reeves's voice, controlled, and underneath it, Patricia Sloane's voice, which had lost its controlled quality entirely and had become something rawer and less practiced. Emily heard that and felt nothing she could easily name. Not triumph, not relief. Something more complicated. The particular feeling of a reckoning arriving after a long delay, which was not the same as satisfaction because the delay had cost things that weren't coming back. Her phone buzzed. Doris. "Holbrook just lawyered up. That's how you know it's real." Emily put the phone away. She looked at Webb. He was watching her with the expression of someone who had known her in a different context and was comparing the two versions, not finding them different, she thought, but finding them consistent in ways that apparently mattered to him. "You stayed last night," he said again. The same thing he'd said in the bay at 3 a.m. "You needed the treatment," she said. "I know why you stayed," he said. "I'm not asking." Emily looked at her hands. "The Army wants to do something formal," he said, "when I'm out of here. Something public." He watched her. "Your thoughts on that?" She thought about being 25 years old in a fire base at 2 a.m, making decisions she could not discuss for 4 years. She thought about Stone Valley, 14 months, the accumulated weight of being invisible. She thought about Mrs. Holloway in Bay 4, who had asked for her by name and held her hand a moment longer than necessary. "I want to keep working," she said, "as a nurse. That doesn't change." "It doesn't have to," Webb said. "I know." She paused. "But yes, to the formal thing, for the record." Another pause. "So it's on the record?" Webb nodded. Then his face shifted. Not dramatically, but the way a face shifts when a monitor on the wall does something that requires attention. Emily turned instinctively, already reading the numbers before her eyes fully focused, and what she saw on the screen was not an emergency, but it was a change, a small and specific change in a value that had been trending well for the last 2 hours and was now doing something different. She stood. She went to the monitor. She looked at the readout. She looked at the IV line. She looked at his face. And she understood, in the same way she had understood in the hallway at midnight, with the same quality of recognition that the body produces before the brain has finished its sentence, that this was not over. Not the recovery, not the morning, not what was happening in the room down the hall with Reeves and Patricia Sloane. She hit the call button. She was already moving to the door to flag the nursing station when she heard, from down the hall, a voice she did not recognize. Not Reeves, not Watkins, not anyone she had cataloged this morning. A male voice, sharp, raised above the ambient noise of the corridor in a way that turned heads at the nursing station. She stopped in the doorway. The voice was coming from the elevator bank. A man in a suit she had not seen before, 50s, with the coloring of someone who had not slept either, and the posture of someone who was angry rather than frightened, which was a specific and important distinction. He was looking at Gerald Park, the deputy director, and he was saying loudly enough to carry, "You had no authority to allow federal personnel access without notifying the board. None. And when the board finds out what kind of liability this hospital is now..." Park was trying to respond. The man in the suit cut him off. Emily looked at the nursing station, where the day-charge nurse was already moving toward Webb's room in response to the call button. She stepped aside to let her pass. She looked back at the man in the suit. She looked at Park's face, and she understood that this man was not law enforcement, was not military, was not any part of the apparatus that had arrived this morning to do something that was going to help. He was someone who had been called. She looked back at the nursing station and found Kevin, who had come back to the floor and was standing near the desk with the expression of someone who recognized what they were looking at. "Who is that?" Emily said quietly. Kevin's jaw was tight. "Dennis Holbrook's brother-in-law," he said. "He's on the hospital board." Emily stood in the hallway of Stone Valley Medical Center at 8:51 a.m., with the monitoring alarm from Webb's room beginning to sound its measured, insistent note behind her, and the voice of a board member down the hall getting louder, and the door of the consultation room still closed on whatever was happening inside it, and she felt the morning, which had seemed an hour ago to be moving towards something resolved, tilt suddenly in a direction she had not accounted for. The alarm from Webb's room was not the kind that cleared a hallway. It was steady, measured, the alert for a value that needed attention rather than the cascade that meant emergency. But in the context of this morning, in this hallway, with everything already tilted at the wrong angle, it carried more weight than the sound itself contained. Emily made a decision in about half a second. She went back into the room. The day charge nurse, a woman named Sandra, competent, experienced, someone Emily had worked alongside for 14 months without ever having a real conversation, was already at the monitor. She looked at Emily with the particular expression of someone who was aware that Emily was not currently authorized to be on this floor and was also aware that Emily had just read the monitor faster than she had. "His pressure's dipping," Emily said. It was not a question. "I see it." Sandra reached for the call button to page the attending. She did not tell Emily to leave. Some situations made the bureaucratic layer irrelevant, and both of them understood that. Emily went to Webb's IV line. Not to change anything. She had no authority to change anything, and changing it without knowing what the attending was going to want would be a mistake she wasn't going to make. But she looked at it, traced it visually, checked the site, checked the flow rate, checked the bag level. "Rate's fine," she said. "Bag's fine." Webb was watching her. His face had the focused quality of someone setting aside the experience of being the patient and doing his own assessment of the situation, which was probably occupational. "What's my pressure, Liz?" he said. 88/60, Sandra said. She was on the phone now, paging. "That's down from 96 this morning," he said. Not alarmed, noting. "Yes," Emily said, the infection. "Possibly. Or the body recalibrating after the treatment. Either way, it needs to be evaluated." She looked at Sandra. "Is Osei still on?" "She was supposed to be. Let me check." Osei was still on. She had stayed past the end of her shift, which was either dedication or the particular inability to leave that hits physicians when a case they are invested in is unresolved. She arrived in Webb's room in 4 minutes, which in the context of this morning felt like both very fast and not fast enough. She looked at the monitor. She looked at Emily. "Brief me," she said. Emily briefed her. 60 seconds, precise, no redundancy. Osei listened with her eyes on the readout and her hands already moving toward the chart. "I want to repeat CBC and a metabolic panel," Osei said to Sandra, "and someone tell me where his temp is right now." 101.1, Sandra said, reading from the most recent auto-logged reading. "Down from this morning. That's the treatment working." Osei was typing. "The pressure drop might be vasodilation response. We see it with this class of treatment during the initial efficacy phase." She paused. "Or it's a secondary complication we haven't identified." "How long to know which?" Webb said. "Blood draw will take 40 minutes for results. Clinical picture will start telling me something in the next hour." She looked at him with the directness of a doctor who had decided sometime in the last 8 hours that this patient was owed honesty rather than management. "You're not in immediate danger, but you're not stable yet. And I'd like you to stop having conversations that are taking you off the monitors." Webb looked at Emily. "You should go deal with what's happening in the hallway," he said. "I was going to," she said. She went. The man in the suit, Holbrook's brother-in-law, the board member, was named Russell Pratt, and he had been on the Stone Valley board for 6 years, which was 4 years less than Patricia Sloan had been nursing director, and Russell Pratt and Patricia Sloan had what could be described, if you were being precise, as a mutually beneficial professional relationship that had never been documented as such, because neither of them was careless enough to document it. Emily did not know this yet. She would, within the hour. But right now she knew his name, his connection to Holbrook, and the volume of his voice in the sixth-floor hallway, and that was enough to understand the shape of what she was looking at. Pratt had cornered Gerald Park against the wall near the elevator bank, and was performing the kind of administrative fury that was designed to intimidate through sheer noise and institutional authority, the fury of someone who believed that being loud in a hospital hallway was the same as being correct. Park was not a weak man, but he was a cautious one, and caution in the face of a board member who was actively threatening liability was not a posture that produced backbone. Doris was standing 8 feet away, watching. Emily came to stand beside her. "He's been at it for 12 minutes, Doris said quietly. "He wants the federal personnel removed from the premises. He's citing something about proper board notification of federal access." "Is that a real requirement?" "It's a real requirement for some things," Doris said. "Not for this. The protocols for active duty military personnel receiving emergency treatment at a civilian facility do not require board approval for federal representatives to be present. He knows this. He's betting Park doesn't." She paused. "He's also betting that if he can get Reeves's team out of that consultation room before they finish with Sloan, he can create enough procedural noise to delay whatever's happening in there." Emily watched Pratt. He was good at this. The particular performance of righteous authority, the vocabulary of institutional process deployed as a weapon. She had seen it in different forms and different contexts, this specific type of person who had learned that institutions could be turned against the people inside them by anyone who spoke the institution's language fluently enough. "Watkins is still in there," Emily said. "Yes, and Reeves." Doris glanced at the consultation room door. "They're not going to come out because a board member is raising his voice in a hallway." As if in response to this observation, the consultation room door opened. It was not Reeves, it was Watkins. The JAG attorney, charcoal suit, the quiet efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough that nothing surprised her. She looked at Pratt. She looked at Park. She assessed the situation in roughly the time it took her to walk from the door to the elevator bank. "Mr. Pratt," she said. Pratt turned. He took in the suit, the posture, the briefcase. He recalibrated, but not much. He was not the type to recalibrate significantly. "Are you with the federal team that's been given unauthorized access to this facility?" "I'm Judge Advocate General's Corps, Department of the Army," Watkins said. "And the access is authorized under Title 10, Section 1074, which governs medical care for active duty personnel at civilian facilities. If you'd like, I can walk you through the specific provisions. What? I'd like you to explain why this hospital's board was not notified. Notification to civilian administrative boards is not required under the provision I cited." Her voice was entirely even. "If you have a specific legal objection, I'm happy to hear it. If you'd like to contact your own counsel, that's also your right." She looked at Park. "Mr. Park, we'll need the conference room on 7 for the next portion of our process. Can you arrange that?" Park, visibly relieved to have a task that was not standing in the hallway being yelled at, said yes and moved toward the elevator. Pratt looked at Watkins. Watkins looked at Pratt. The look lasted exactly as long as it needed to, which was long enough to communicate that she was not going to be moved and that the hallway performance had reached the end of its utility. Pratt took out his phone. "I'm calling the board chair," he said. "That's your right," Watkins said. "Please take the call in a non-clinical area. Hospital policy." She turned and walked back toward the consultation room without waiting to see what Pratt did next. Emily watched him for a moment. He was already on the phone, moving toward the stairwell. The same stairwell that had captured him and Patricia Sloan in a time-stamped security screenshot at 3:08 a.m. And she thought, not for the first time this morning, about how certain people believe that the phone call is the move, the institutional intervention, the board chair, the leverage, and how that belief tends to be most unshakable in people who have used it successfully for a long time and have therefore never had to learn what happens when it stops working. She looked at Doris. "What's happening in that room?" "Sloan is being asked to account for every decision made between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m., Doris said. My guess is she's moved from denial to a version of justification. She'll say the conduct decisions were made on clinical and administrative grounds independent of the patient's identity or the military situation. She paused. The stairwell footage and the gap in the security system are going to be significant problems for that argument. Holbrook created the gap. Yes, and Holbrook lawyered up 40 minutes ago, which means he is currently not answering questions and also not protecting Patricia Sloan. Doris's voice was dry. When the person who created the evidence against you declines to support your version of events, the version of events tends to suffer. Emily looked at the consultation room door. Behind it, Patricia Sloan was in a room with Colonel Reeves and a JAG attorney and 14 months of nursing notes, and a security screenshot and the documented timeline of a night that had not gone the way it was planned. She thought about Patricia standing in the hallway outside Bay 4 at 2:30 a.m. with a form in her hand and a decision already made. The confidence of it. The practiced efficiency of a woman who had done this before and expected to do it again. Emily felt something she had been careful with for 14 months release slightly. Not completely, not with any sense of arrival, but enough that she noticed it, the way you notice when a muscle you've been holding tense finally does something different. She went to find Kevin. Kevin was at the nursing station, where he had apparently positioned himself for the last 2 hours under the premise of completing charting and the actual purpose of tracking what was happening on the floor. He looked up when Emily approached. He looked like someone who had made a decision about which side of a line to be on, and was now living with the knowledge that decisions have consequences, and consequences arrive. "The footage you pulled," Emily said. "Who else knows you have it?" "I sent a copy to my personal email before I printed it," he said. "And I told Sandra, nobody else." "Okay." She looked at him. He was 26 and had been a nurse for 2 years and had spent the night watching something unfold that his training had not prepared him for. "You did the right thing." "I don't know what the right thing is yet," he said. "I know what I did." That was more honest than most people managed, Emily thought. She nodded. "Sloane's been talking to you differently this year," Kevin said. It was not a question. He was looking at the desk rather than at her. "All of us saw it. Nobody said anything because—" He stopped. "Because saying something had a cost," Emily said. "Yes." He looked up. "I'm sorry." "I know," she said. She meant it without sentimentality, which was the right way to mean it. "Make sure your documentation on last night is complete and accurate. Everything you observed, time-stamped. Your supervisor's going to ask for it, and so is someone else." She left him there. She was at the elevator when Reeves came out of the consultation room. Reeves looked down the hallway. She found Emily with the economy of someone accustomed to finding people quickly. She came toward her. "She's talking," Reeves said, when she was close enough that the words didn't carry. Not quiet. Reeves was not a theatrical whisperer, but calibrated. She tried the administrative justification angle for about 10 minutes, and then Watkins put the stairwell image on the table, and she stopped talking for a while, and then she started again on a different track. What track? That she was acting in the hospital's interest, that she had reason to believe you were a disruptive presence who created a liability, that the patient's identity was not a factor in her decision. Reeves paused. She's constructing an argument that has no connection to the sequence of her actual actions, which is a problem, because Watkins has a timeline that is very detailed and entirely sourced from documentation that Sloan herself or her people created. Emily said nothing. "The billing inquiry is separate from this," Reeves said. "That's going to take longer and involve different people, but Watkins has handed what she has to the appropriate parties, and the nursing board complaint that was filed against you is now being reviewed in the context of the full investigative picture, which is not the context it was designed to be reviewed in." She paused. "That complaint is going to be withdrawn, officially, with a notation in your record." Emily absorbed that. A notation in her record, the clean removal of something that had been placed there with the specific purpose of ending her professional life. "The financial piece," Emily said. "How long?" "The full picture? Months. But the preliminary findings are enough to trigger an immediate audit of the administrative structure, which means the people currently in positions of authority here are going to find those positions complicated." Reeves looked at her steadily. Patricia Sloan is not walking out of this building today in the same position she came in. There was something else in Reeves' expression, something that had not been there earlier in the morning, a quality that was specifically different from the efficient delivery of information that had characterized the conversation in the consultation room. "What?" Emily said. Reeves was quiet for a moment. This was unusual for Reeves, who Emily had only ever seen pause when she was choosing between two accurate things to say rather than deciding whether to say something. "When you were separated from the unit 4 years ago," Reeves said, "the classification level on your record was set by people above my pay grade, and I was not in a position to modify it. I want you to know that I disagreed with that decision at the time." She looked at Emily. "I didn't push hard enough against it. That's mine." Emily looked at her. "You didn't know I was here," Emily said, "in this city, in this hospital." "No," Reeves said. "Marcus found you, or found out where you were. He had reason to want to know." A pause. "He kept track of the people he served with, all of them. He's that kind of commander." Emily thought about Webb lying in a bed at 3 a.m., writing 4 lines on a notepad from a hospital bedside table. He'd been awake, he'd been tracking. Even running a fever with a combat infection and a gunshot wound, he had been oriented enough to understand what was happening and to act on it in the only way available to him. That was either very touching or slightly terrifying, and Emily suspected it was both. "Okay," she said to Reeves, "what do you need from me today?" What Reeves needed was a formal statement, and Watkins took it in the conference room on 7, with the recorder running and Doris sitting beside Emily, making periodic notes and contributing exactly 1 intervention in 40 minutes, which was when Watkins asked a question that had a legal dimension Doris wanted framed correctly. The statement took the shape Emily had expected: chronological, clinical, grounded in observation and documented fact. What she had seen, what she had done, what had been said to her and by whom. Watkins was meticulous and unhurried, circling back to specific moments with follow-up questions that told Emily where the investigative interest was concentrated. The points of highest interest were, in order, the precise timeline of her interaction with Briggs regarding the infection concern, the exact wording of Patricia Sloan's instruction to leave the floor, the sequence of events surrounding the security gap that Holbrook had apparently engineered, and the moment when she had initiated treatment without attending authorization. On that last point, Emily was direct. "I made the call," she said. "I understood the protocol I was working outside of. I understood the professional consequences. The patient was deteriorating and the attending had declined to act on a documented concern. I chose to prioritize the patient." "And if the treatment had been wrong?" Watkins asked. "Not hostile, clinical." "Then the consequence would have been mine," Emily said. "But the treatment wasn't wrong." Watkins made a note. Doris said nothing. She had known, when Emily said it, that it was the correct thing to say, and the correct way to say it, because it was honest and it was defensible and it matched everything that the clinical record showed. Doris had represented enough people in enough situations to know that the ones who tried to minimize what they'd done always came off worse than the ones who were precise about it. By the time the statement was complete and signed, it was 11:30 a.m. Emily had been awake for 31 hours. She went downstairs and bought the worst coffee the hospital cafeteria offered, and sat at a table by the window that looked out on the parking lot and drank it without tasting it. At 11:47 a.m., exactly 12 hours after the Black Hawk had landed, Doris came and sat across from her. "Holbrook's attorney made contact," Doris said. "He's looking to cooperate in exchange for consideration on the billing charges." She watched Emily's face. "That means he's going to give them what they need on Sloan." Emily held her coffee cup. "How much is there?" "On the billing, apparently substantial, but the part that matters for you, the retaliation pattern, the suppressed complaints, the systematic removal of staff who created documentation problems for the administration, Holbrook was the one who managed the record system. He has access to things that should have been deleted and weren't, because he was covering himself, keeping his own insurance." Doris paused. "He kept records of instructions Sloan gave him, in writing. Apparently she used email in ways she will regret for a very long time." Emily thought about Patricia Sloan and her paper trail. The careful, organized, institutionally expressed version of control that she had wielded for 11 years. The irony of being undone by the same impulse, the impulse to document, to maintain a record, was not lost on Emily, and she thought it probably shouldn't be. "Cara Mendez," Emily said, "the nurse who filed the complaint before she left." "I have her contact information," Doris said. "I've already reached out. She wants to know what's happening." Emily nodded. At 12:15, her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, and she almost didn't pick up, and then she did. It was Dr. Osei. "His numbers are back up," Osei said. No preamble. "Pressure stabilized at 98 over 64 40 minutes ago, and it's holding. The CBC looks consistent with the treatment working. I'm cautiously optimistic." Emily let out a breath she had been holding since the alarm at 8:51. "Thank you for calling," she said. "You'd have wanted to know," Osei said. She paused. "I also wanted to say, your nursing notes from last night. They're thorough." Another pause. "I've been practicing for 12 years, and I don't think I've ever seen documentation that clear at that hour on a night like last night." Emily didn't say anything. "I should have pushed harder on Briggs," Osei said. "At 2 a.m. When you brought the concern, I authorized the test, but I could have pushed harder before that. I want you to know I understand that." "You authorized the test," Emily said. "That's what mattered." "It was the minimum," Osei said. Emily appreciated that she said it. She did not say so because Osei wasn't looking for absolution, and this conversation was not that kind of conversation. "How's Briggs?" Emily said. A pause. "Quiet," Osei said. "He's been quiet all morning." After the call, Emily sat with the bad coffee for a while. The cafeteria was filling up. The lunch hour crowd, the particular mix of hospital people and visitors, and the occasional person who had just spent hours in a waiting room and had finally remembered that they hadn't eaten. Normal. Ordinary. The hospital operating in its ordinary mode around the extraordinary thing that was happening on its 6th floor. At 1 p.m., Doris appeared in the cafeteria doorway and gestured. Emily followed her to the elevator and they went back up to 6. The hallway was different now. The particular tension of the morning had not dissipated but had changed quality. From the unpredictable tension of a situation in motion to the different tension of a situation that had been decided and whose edges were being formalized. Russell Pratt was gone. Emily did not know what conversation he had been part of or not part of, but his absence had the feeling of a predictable outcome rather than a surprise. Watkins was near the nursing station, on her phone, her voice low and efficient. Outside the consultation room, which had been the site of the morning's most significant conversation, there were 2 people Emily had not seen before. Not military, not legal, the particular plainclothes quality of administrative investigators from a government body that operates by showing up and asking questions and waiting. Gerald Park was standing near them with the expression of a man who had been cooperative all morning and was finding cooperation expensive. And Patricia Sloan was coming out of the consultation room. She did not look the way Emily had expected her to look. She had expected something harder, the controlled mask, the administrative distance. What she saw instead was a woman who had been in a room for 4 hours and had come out looking her age, which was not something Patricia Sloan had ever looked in any professional context Emily had witnessed. She looked tired. She looked like the kind of tired that is not about sleep. She stopped when she saw Emily. The hallway had enough people in it that this was not a private moment, and both of them knew it. The day-charge nurse was at the station. Kevin was near the supply room doorway. One of Webb's soldiers was by the ICU entrance. Doris was 2 steps behind Emily. Patricia looked at Emily the way a person looks at someone when they have run out of the particular resource they have been using to manage them. And Emily looked back at her with the simple, steady regard of someone who has nothing left to perform. Patricia said nothing. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood with her back partially to the hallway, and the elevator came and she got in, and the doors closed. That was all. It was not dramatic. It was not satisfying in the way that things are satisfying in stories. It was quiet and somewhat diminished and entirely real. And Emily stood in the hallway and watched the closed elevator doors and felt something that was not triumph and not relief, but was closer to the feeling of setting down something you have been carrying for a very long time and discovering that your hands are a different shape than you remembered. Reeves appeared at her elbow. "We're going to need you available for follow-up over the next several weeks," she said. "This isn't a single-day process." "I know," Emily said. The nursing board withdrawal will be filed today. Your employment status is a civil matter that will take longer, but Watkins has flagged it to the appropriate people, and your counsel has the documentation to move forward. She paused. You'll need to decide what you want to ask for. I want my job back, Emily said. Reeves looked at her for a moment. The same position? A better one, Emily said. And then she looked at Reeves with something that was almost, after 32 hours of not quite managing it, a version of wry. Same floor, though. I know where everything is. Reeves made a sound that was the closest Emily had ever heard her come to a laugh. At 2 p.m., Doris pulled Emily into the conference room on 7 and closed the door and sat across from her and put both hands flat on the table with the posture of someone who is about to say something they want to say clearly. I've received a preliminary communication from the hospital's legal counsel, she said. They want to initiate a conversation about resolution. Emily looked at her. They're moving fast because the board found out about the billing inquiry, Doris said. Not from Pratt, from their own audit processes that were apparently already running and that the billing inquiry has now intersected with. The board is not going to stand behind the administration that was in place when this happened. They're going to distance themselves as fast as they can, and distancing themselves means offering you something. What are they offering? They haven't stated a number yet. The conversation is about whether you're willing to have the conversation. Doris looked at her steadily. I want to know what you want, not what you'll accept, what you want. Emily thought about it. Not for long. She had, without knowing she was doing it, been thinking about this question for 14 months. I want the complaints removed from my record, officially, with documentation of their origin. She paused. I want Cara Mendez to know she wasn't wrong about what she saw. I want whatever avenue exists for that complaint she filed to be properly investigated, and its findings acknowledged. She paused again. And I want the nursing staff on that floor to have a department head who doesn't treat them as variables to be managed. Doris looked at her. Those are goals, not numbers, Doris said. The numbers are yours, Emily said. That's what I'm paying you for. Doris smiled for the first time all day. It was brief and somewhat sharp, the smile of a person who genuinely enjoys their work. Then Emily's phone buzzed. It was Kevin. A text, no words, just a screenshot. She looked at it for a moment before she understood what she was seeing. It was a photo of a document, not a medical record, not a legal filing, a spreadsheet, column headers in small type. Dollar amounts in 6 figures, dates going back 7 years. In the column labeled Auth was a single set of initials, repeated across 2 years' worth of entries. P.S. She looked at the second text Kevin had sent, 3 seconds after the first. This was in the shared administrative drive, in a folder labeled Vendor Contracts. I found it because I was looking for something else. I don't know if I was supposed to find it. Emily stared at the screen. This was not the billing irregularity that the federal inquiry had identified. This was something separate, something that had been sitting in a shared drive under a mislabeled folder for what appeared to be, based on the date range in the spreadsheet, the better part of 3 years. She forwarded it to Doris without speaking. Doris looked at her phone. She looked at the screenshot. She looked at Emily. Where did this come from? She said. A nurse who was looking for something else, Emily said. Doris looked at the spreadsheet again for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Watkins. There's something you need to see, she said when Watkins picked up, and I think it changes the scope of what you're looking at considerably. She listened for a moment. She looked at Emily. She wants to know if you have the original document or just the screenshot, Doris said. Emily texted Kevin, Can you access the original file? The reply came in 40 seconds. It's still in the drive. I didn't touch it. Emily looked at Doris. Original file, she said. Still in place. Untouched. Doris relayed it, listened, nodded. When she hung up, she was quiet for a moment with the particular stillness of someone who has just understood that a case they thought they knew the shape of is considerably larger than they measured. Watkins is sending someone to image the drive, she said. Right now, before anyone else in the administration realizes it's there and does something about it. She paused. If that spreadsheet is what it looks like, what does it look like? Emily said. Doris set her phone down slowly. It looks like Patricia Sloan has been authorizing payments to a vendor that does not appear in any official hospital contract database, she said, for a period of 3 years, totaling an amount that is going to be very difficult to explain, to people who are going to be very interested in the explanation. The conference room was quiet. Emily sat with the bad coffee she'd brought up from the cafeteria, which was now cold, and the particular understanding that the morning had revealed something, and the afternoon had deepened it, and the thing in the spreadsheet on the shared administrative drive was neither the beginning nor the end, but was the moment when a wall that had been standing for a long time showed the full extent of what was behind it. Down the hall, in a room that smelled of antiseptic and the particular staleness of recycled hospital air, Marcus Webb's monitors were stable, and his temperature was coming down, and the treatment that should have started 6 hours earlier than it did was working because one nurse had made a decision at 3 a.m. that she had known, going in, was going to cost her. And in the stairwell that connected the 6th floor to the administrative suites, in a building that was in the process of discovering what it had been built on, Emily heard footsteps. Quick, descending, the sound of someone moving with purpose and not enough time, and looked up at the ceiling and understood, with the same quality of recognition she had learned to trust, that the people who had believed this morning was going to be the end of Emily Dawson had made the specific error of underestimating what was still coming. The footsteps in the stairwell faded and didn't come back. Watkins' people imaged the administrative drive at 2:34 p.m. It took 11 minutes. The folder labeled Vendor Contracts was preserved exactly as Kevin had found it, untouched, the metadata intact, the access log showing that no one had opened it in 17 days, and that the last person to do so had logged in under Dennis Holbrook's credentials. Holbrook's attorney, when informed of the discovery, requested a 30-minute recess from the cooperation conversation he was already in the middle of. He did not get 30 minutes. He got 10. When he came back, he was considerably more cooperative than he had been before, and the shape of what he offered changed in ways that his attorney tried to moderate and mostly failed to, because Holbrook had apparently decided that the distance between his situation and Patricia Sloan's situation was a distance worth paying to establish, and establishing it required telling the truth about things that the spreadsheet had already made undeniable. Emily was not in that room. She did not need to be. She sat in the conference room on 7 with Doris and a cup of coffee that was slightly better than the cafeteria version because one of Watkins' staff had gone to the place 2 blocks away, and she did something she had not done in 33 hours. She stopped moving forward and sat still and let the afternoon be what it was. It was not peaceful. It was not the clean, cinematic stillness of someone who has won something. It was the exhausted, slightly disoriented stillness of someone who has been in motion through something enormous and has arrived at a pause without yet fully understanding what has changed and what hasn't. Doris sat across from her and did paperwork, which was its own form of consideration, giving Emily the silence without performing the giving of it. At 4:15, Watkins came in. She sat down. She looked at Emily with the particular expression she had. Not warm, not cold, precise in the way of someone who chose their words the way surgeons choose instruments. Holbrook's cooperation covers the following, she said. The security system gap was deliberate. He created it remotely at 11:22 p.m. before the Blackhawk landed, based on a call from Patricia Sloan at 11:09 p.m. in which she was informed by someone in the administrative notification chain that an emergency military transport was incoming. She paused. She made the decision to manage the unit's exposure before she knew who the patient was or what the circumstances were. The decision to remove you specifically was made because your documentation history represented the clearest risk to administrative control of the narrative. Emily looked at the table. She wasn't trying to protect the hospital, she said. She was trying to protect a financial arrangement that the billing inquiry was already close to identifying, Watkins said. The vendor payments. 7 years. Just under $2 million in total, routed through a contractor entity that Holbrook created and that has no evidence of services rendered. She paused. She needed the floor quiet. She needed the night to pass without documentation she couldn't manage. You were the documentation risk. And Webb, Emily said. She didn't know who he was until after he was admitted. By then, the removal process was already in motion. Watkins set a paper on the table. The nursing board complaint she filed against you was the third such complaint she had filed against staff members in the past 4 years. The previous two resulted in resignations before the complaints were fully reviewed. She had reason to believe this mechanism worked. Emily looked at the paper. It was a formal notice. The nursing board complaint marked withdrawn, with a processing date of that afternoon, and a notation that indicated the withdrawal was being accompanied by a referral for investigation of the complaint's origin and the circumstances of its filing. She picked it up. She read it twice. It was 1 page. It was not dramatic. It was a document that said, in bureaucratic language, that a thing which had been placed in her path was being removed, and that the person who placed it was now being asked to account for that. She set it down. "Dr. Briggs?" she said. Watkins was quiet for a moment. Dr. Briggs is not part of the criminal referral. His actions last night were consistent with patterns the medical staff review board will need to address through their own process. That's a different channel. I know, Emily said. I'm not asking for him to be in the criminal referral. I'm asking what happens to a physician who dismisses a nursing assessment that is subsequently proven correct and that, if not corrected by the nurse acting outside her authority, would have resulted in patient death. Watkins looked at her. The medical staff review board will have access to the full timeline of last night, including Dr. Osie's documentation, your notes, and Commander Webb's statement. She paused. That process has its own pace and its own outcome. I can't predict it, but it will happen. It will happen, Watkins said. Emily nodded. That was not everything. It was not the clean, total accountability that the part of her that had been carrying 14 months of signed forms would have preferred. Briggs would face a review board, not a courtroom. The review board might produce a formal reprimand or mandatory additional training or a notation or nothing. These processes had their own logic and their own pace and their own capacity for institutional protection of people who had been in the building long enough to have accumulated protection. She was aware of that. She had always been aware that justice, when it arrived in parts, and not all of those parts were satisfying. But Webb was alive. The documentation existed. The complaint was withdrawn. The spreadsheet was in federal hands. Patricia Sloan was in a conversation she couldn't end. Those were real things. She went to see Webb at 5 p.m. She had not been back to his room since the morning. The day had had its own current, and it had carried her through rooms and conversations and the particular sustained effort of being present in a situation that required her to be present in it. And she had followed that current because following it was what the situation needed. His room was quieter than the morning. The soldier who had been stationed at the door had been replaced by a different one. Same posture, different face. And he gave her the same evaluating look as the first one and let her through. Webb was sitting up. More color than he'd had. The monitors were calm, the IV still running, the evidence of active treatment still present, but no longer carrying the urgency of the previous 12 hours. He looked like a man who was injured and tired rather than a man who had been close to the edge. He looked at her for a moment. "You look worse than I do," he said. "You got to lie down," she said. She sat in the chair beside the bed, which she had not done before. She had always been standing when she was in this room, the posture of function, of someone there to do something. Sitting felt different, like an acknowledgement that the acute part was over. "How bad is it?" he said. He meant the investigation. He had been briefed. Reeves had come by at some point in the afternoon. But he was asking her specifically, which was its own thing. "Bad enough," she said. "For them." He nodded. He looked at the window. Afternoon light, the kind that comes in low and golden and makes hospital rooms look briefly like somewhere else. "You stayed last night," he said for the third time. Emily looked at him. "You're going to keep saying that." "Until I've said it enough times," he said. "I was aware of everything in that room from the minute they brought me in. I heard what Briggs said to you. I heard the woman with the form." He paused. "I've been in a lot of situations where someone had every reason to leave and didn't. It doesn't get less significant because of repetition." Emily did not say anything for a moment. "You said on the notepad that it wasn't over for you either," she said. "The us part." "The Army dropped the ball on your record," he said. "That's not abstract for me. You served. You did the job. The classification was protective of the mission. I understood that, and I think you understood it too. But when you left the service, you should have had a record that reflected what you'd actually done." He looked at her. Reeves filed the formal recommendation for the service recognition 2 days ago, before she got on the plane. She'd been sitting on the recommendation for 6 months because the declassification process was slow, and she was waiting for clearance. Emily absorbed that. 6 months, she said. Bureaucracy, he said. Not an apology for it, just the word. She looked at the window too. The light was doing the same thing it had been doing before, indifferent to the morning, the afternoon, the particular wait of the last 18 hours. Light didn't care what had happened. It just came in where it could find an opening. "I want to keep nursing," she said. "I know. The recognition, on whatever form it takes, it can't change that. I'm not going to become something ceremonial." "Nobody's asking you to," he said. "Reeves knows who you are. The Army isn't trying to turn you into a poster." He paused. "They're trying to correct a record that was wrong. That's all it is." Emily thought about that for a while. The difference between recognition and transformation, between being seen accurately and being remade into something that served someone else's narrative. She had spent 4 years in the military and 14 months in this hospital in different versions of the same situation, her actual self on one side of a line, and what the institution needed her to be on the other. The recognition was not going to fix that. She understood institutions well enough to know they didn't transform people. They documented them, categorized them, filed them, and moved on. But the record would be accurate, and accuracy was not nothing. "Thank you," she said, "for finding me, for the note." He looked at her. "You would have done the same thing without the note." "Probably," she said. But it helped. Tuck. 3 weeks later, Dennis Holbrook accepted a plea arrangement that included full cooperation, disgorgement of assets, and a sentence recommendation that his attorney described publicly as the best available outcome given the evidence. His attorney was technically correct. Patricia Sloan was charged separately. The charges were not minor: wire fraud, obstruction of an internal investigation, retaliation against protected employee activity, and conspiracy in connection with the vendor payment scheme. Her attorney issued a statement describing the charges as an overreach. The statement was 4 paragraphs and mentioned the word context 7 times, which is generally what happens when context is the only remaining argument. The hospital board accepted the resignation of Gerald Park, who had not been charged with anything but had become an artifact of an administration that the board was now highly motivated to publicly replace. Russell Pratt resigned from the board 3 days after the initial federal referral became public, citing personal reasons. His personal reasons were not examined closely by anyone who didn't already know what they were. The nursing board complaint against Emily was not just withdrawn. The filing itself became part of a separate inquiry into the nursing board's intake procedures, which had apparently processed 3 complaints from the same institutional source across 4 years without flagging the pattern. The inquiry was not comfortable for several people, and its conclusions were being waited on. Cara Mendez was contacted by Doris in the first week. She had been working at a clinic 40 miles away, the kind of smaller, under-resourced facility that absorbs a lot of nurses who have left larger institutions under difficult circumstances. She came in for a meeting with Doris and the investigative team and spent 2 hours providing documentation she had kept in a folder in her apartment for 8 months because she had not been sure she would ever need it and had been unable to bring herself to throw it away. The folder had receipts, in the form of email chains and printed calendar records, for 4 conversations with Patricia Sloan in which she had been told, in language that was careful but unmistakable, that her complaint would not be investigated internally and that her continued employment was contingent on her willingness to align with the department's priorities. She had held on to all of it. Emily met her in the hospital cafeteria on the day Cara came to provide her formal statement. They had not known each other well before, had passed each other in hallways, exchanged the brief professional courtesies of people on the same floor. Now they sat across from each other with bad coffee and the particular quality of recognition between 2 people who have been through different versions of the same experience. "I didn't know about your notes," Cara said, "when I filed the complaint. I didn't know you were documenting." "I didn't know I was either," Emily said. "Not in that sense." Cara looked at her cup. I thought leaving was the only option. I thought staying meant, I don't know, absorbing it, and I couldn't absorb it anymore. You were right to file the complaint, Emily said. It went nowhere. It went somewhere, Emily said. It went into a file. It became a piece of a picture that needed enough pieces to be visible. You were one of them. She paused. The fact that it didn't produce an immediate result is a failure of the institution. That's not the same as the complaint failing. Kara looked at her for a long moment. How are you still here? She said. Not hostile, genuinely asking. Emily thought about it. I don't know, she said, which was honest. I'm good at staying still when things are bad. I don't know if that's a virtue or a stubbornness problem. Kara almost smiled. Maybe both. Probably boths, Emily agreed. The formal recognition ceremony was not what Emily had expected, which was probably because she had been expecting something she didn't want and received something different. It was small. A room at a government building in the city, not a parade ground, not a press event. Reeves was there. Watkins. 3 people in uniform Emily didn't recognize, but whose presence indicated the level of attention that had been paid to getting this right. Webb was there in civilian clothes, still moving carefully, his left side reminding him regularly of what had happened to it. Doris came. She sat in the back and wore the coat that had seen better years and did not take out the library tote, which was its own form of ceremony. The record correction was read into the official record. Emily's service designation, her commendations, the events of the night that had been listed by coordinates for 4 years, were formally entered into the public register under her name. Her name. Her actual record. Accurate. It took 11 minutes. The citation was precise and factual in the military manner, stripped of decoration, and that was fine. She did not need decoration. She needed accuracy, and accuracy was what she got. When it was over and the formal part had concluded and people were doing the standing around part that follows formal things, Webb came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he turned to face her, and he brought his right hand up, not casually, not quickly, but with the deliberateness of someone who has thought about this moment and decided how it should be done. He saluted her. Not a loose social salute, the real one, clean, held. Emily looked at him. She was 30 years old and she had been invisible in a building full of people for 14 months. And before that, she had been classified for 4 years. And before that, she had been a 24-year-old woman in a firebase making decisions in the dark that no one would know about for years. She had not been saluted since she left the service. She returned it. Because he had earned the response, and because the record was accurate now, and because some things deserved the correct ceremony even when ceremony was not your natural language. He dropped his hand. Come back to work, he said. Not a request, not a command, just the plainest possible version of something he meant. I am, she said. Monday. Eats. She went back on a Monday, as promised, which was 5 weeks after the night of the Black Hawk and the rain and the form Patricia Sloan had handed her in a hallway at 2:30 a.m. Her employment had been formally reinstated 2 weeks prior, accompanied by a letter from the board that was 6 paragraphs long and used the word regrettable 4 times, which was the institutional version of an apology from an entity that could not quite bring itself to say the word. Doris had negotiated the terms. The record corrections, the removal of the documented incidents, the official notation of their retaliatory origin, all of it was there. There was also a new position, not simply her old assignment, a clinical lead role that came with a seat in departmental meetings and the authority to formally raise patient safety concerns through channels that had not existed in practice before, because the channels had existed on paper, but the person managing the paper had been Patricia Sloan. She did not take the position because it was a larger title. She took it because she knew what was missing in this building, and the position was a place from which she could address what was missing, imperfectly and incrementally, which was how things actually got addressed. The first morning back, she did what she had done on her first morning 14 months earlier. She found where the supply rooms were, checked the equipment carts, introduced herself to the nurses she hadn't met. She was not starting over. She was continuing, which was different. Kevin was at the nursing station. He looked up when she came through the door and did not say anything particularly significant, just morning, which was the right amount. Morning, she said. She pulled up her patient assignments. The floor was the same floor. The monitors made the same sounds. The lights were the same institutional lights that did not change for morning or afternoon or the particular hour before dawn when the world gets quiet and you can hear what's actually happening if you're paying attention. She was paying attention. She had always been paying attention. That was the thing no one in this building had understood about her. Not Briggs with his pleasant dismissals, not Patricia with her paper trail, not the administrators who had looked at a 4-year gap in a resume and drawn a conclusion about what it meant. They had looked at Emily Dawson and seen a variable, a problem, a liability, an inconvenience, and in doing so they had made the oldest and most expensive mistake that people in power make. They had assumed that being quiet was the same as being absent. She had never been absent. She had been present in every room, at every hour, noting everything with the trained attention of someone who had learned in a very specific and non-transferable school that the detail you don't bother to record is the one that matters later. She had been building a record without knowing she was building it, because accuracy was not a strategy for her, it was just who she was. The people who had tried to end her career had not understood that. Or maybe they had understood it at the end. That was perhaps why they had been so afraid of her. Mrs. Greta Holloway had been discharged on the morning Emily was removed from the floor. Emily had found that out a week later. She had thought about calling and had decided against it. Mrs. Holloway was home, which was where she needed to be, and Emily's call would be for Emily's benefit, not hers. But Mrs. Holloway called her. She got the number through the hospital's patient liaison system, which was not strictly the intended use of that system, but was also not prohibited. And she called Emily on a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks after her discharge and said, without preamble, "I heard what happened. I wanted you to know I asked about you before I left." "I know," Emily said. "Thank you." "You squeezed my hand back," Mrs. Holloway said. "I noticed." Emily did not respond to that immediately because there was something in the observation, the simple, unglamorous thing of a hand returned, that landed with more weight than most of what had happened in the weeks since. "You take care of yourself," Emily said. "You too," Mrs. Holloway said. "Don't let them make you less." She hung up. Emily sat with the phone in her hand for a while. Don't let them make you less. It was not the most sophisticated formulation of a philosophy. It did not contain legal strategy or institutional mechanism or the precise language of a citation being read into the public record. It was a 73-year-old woman who had been frightened in a hospital bed at 3 in the morning and had noticed that the nurse beside her was someone who was carrying something and had known, with the particular knowledge of someone who had been around long enough to recognize the real thing, that it mattered. That was the thing about being seen. It didn't require institutions. It didn't require records or ceremonies or formal corrective processes, though those things mattered and Emily would not pretend they didn't. It required one person at a time, paying attention, noticing, choosing not to look away. She had done that for others her entire career. One patient, one room, one hand held a moment longer than the protocol required. She had not expected to need it done for her. She had needed it anyway. And it had come. From Ose authorizing the test at 2 a.m., from Kevin pulling footage before anyone thought to tell him not to, from Kara keeping a folder she couldn't bring herself to throw away, from an injured man who had tracked her through 4 years in 2 cities and written her name on a notepad in the dark. The people who underestimated her had never understood this either. She had not been alone. She had appeared alone, because invisibility is a quality that attaches to individuals and makes them look singular. But the web of accurate witness had been there all along, built of small acts, patient and unannounced. That Monday morning, Emily Dawson clocked in at 6:58 a.m. and went to work. Not because she had won, not because the record was accurate now, though it was, not because the people who had tried to make her less had been made to account for it, though they had, because there was a patient in Bay 6 who had been there since overnight and whose chart had a note she wanted to look at before rounds, and because the supply cart nearest the elevator was always running low on something that it shouldn't be running low on, and because this was her floor and she knew where everything was, and knowing where everything was had always been, for her, the first form of power. She had never needed anyone to recognize that, but it helped.